Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke Beppu, and I would like now to continue the discussion with respect to the film SHOAH. I think continuing on from the previous discussion, I'd like now to just continue with more aspects with respect to the first era, or the first big part of the film SHOAH. I'd like to start with the interview that Claude Lanzmann conducts with Franz Suchomel, the SS Unterscharführer, at the extermination camp of Treblinka. Now, this is a very interesting thing, is it not? Because here we get an interview with with someone from the SS, Nazi, and he was in a particular position of authority at one of these extermination camps. Now, according to my understanding, Franz Suchomel only agreed to be recorded, under an audio recording. So the video or the film that is taken of this interview was taken without his knowledge, and it was taken in secret. So that is a very interesting aspect of Claude Lanzmann as an interviewer. And actually, I should just take a moment just to make some comment about that. I think this interview, the fact, first of all, that it was filmed rather than just subject to an audio recording is really fascinating, and it shows an aspect of Lanzmann's interviewing techniques and policy. And I don't know, there might be some issue as far as maybe journalism ethics are concerned, perhaps. I'm not sure. I'm not a journalist, so I'm not sure. But as a watcher of this film, I think what Lanzmann does here is actually quite admirable. And I see no issue with the fact that he filmed this interview. And this interview with Franz Suchomel is also very telling, because it does show, I think, how masterful Claude Lanzmann is as an interviewer. He is at once so welcoming of Franz Suchomel's comments that he lets Franz Suchomel just talk and talk and talk, and he directs him in a way that is very pointed, and with the aim of trying to get Franz Suchomel to provide as much detail as possible. And one other thing I should point out with this interview with Franz Suchomel, Claude Lanzmann is such a masterful interviewer, as I said, because he so very cleverly and deftly and with such a swiftness that is remarkable when one thinks about it. He shows how much Claude Lanzmann is in control, while not necessarily showing that he is in control, if you know what I mean. And he shows just how smart he is, and just how stupid Franz Suchomel is. At one point, Franz Suchomel actually says this. He says this. He's talking about his first impressions of Treblinka when he arrives, and he says, this is what Franz Suchomel says, I didn't want to go. That was proved at my trial. I was told, Mr. Suchomel, there are big workshops there for tailors and shoemakers, and you'll be guarding them. So this is Franz Suchomel saying his own name, Mr. Suchomel. And then much time later, or some moments later, Claude Lanzmann says, I understand, Mr. Suchomel. We're not discussing you, only Treblinka. You are a very important eyewitness, and you can explain what Treblinka was. And then Franz Suchomel very interestingly replies, but don't use my name. And then Lanzmann says, no, I promised. All right, you arrived at Treblinka. And then they discuss his first impressions upon arriving at Treblinka. So in that short exchange, it's very interesting, because Lanzmann uses the fact that Franz Suchomel mentioned his own name first, and then Lanzmann uses it in a question to show how I'm not sure if he did it on purpose, but even if he didn't, it's so wonderful and quite ingenious the way he shows maybe how stupid Franz Suchomel is, and also reveals how insecure Franz Suchomel is, because he doesn't want his name to be mentioned, although he only moments earlier himself mentioned his own name, which is, I don't know, it's maybe that's suggestive of the intelligence of Franz Suchomel. Anyway, this is the interview where he speaks of the horrors of the amount of bodies that apparently were not taken care of properly because the Treblinka camps were killing a large number of Jews in the gas chambers that were built. So these are I understand them to be the old gas chambers that were then subsequently reconstructed or built again. So there was a lot of death that was occurring, but there was apparently some trouble with respect to how to deal with the bodies afterwards. So he talks about, just mentions this idea about how it was awful for the Germans, which is mind-boggling. I can't even believe he mentioned this. He mentions that he says you could smell it everywhere for miles. It depended on the wind. The stink was carried on the wind. Understand? And he mentions earlier, bear in mind the graves were maybe 18, 20 feet deep, all crammed with bodies, a thin layer of sand, and the heat, you see, it was a hell up there. And then Landsman asks, you saw that? And Suchomel says, yes, just once, the first day, we puked and wept. Yes, we wept. Yes, the smell was infernal. This is it's amazing that Landsman was able to get this footage the way he did and still maintain his composure as the interviewer, which really is just a testament to how brilliant Landsman as the interviewer was in this film SHOAH. It's just I marvel at how he was able to keep his composure as Franz Suchomel was talking, because Franz Suchomel's comments here are just so sickening. Anyway, as we continue with this first era, we then talk about Philipp Müller, who was part of the special detail. He was actually dealing with the bodies, and he's talking about how there's this idea that he mentioned, which is a very frightening thing he says, which is, when we undressed some of them, the order was given to feed the ovens. Suddenly an SS man rushed up and told me, "Get out of here, go stir the bodies." What did he mean, stir the bodies? I entered the cremation chamber. There was a Jewish prisoner, Fischel, who later became a squad leader. He looked at me, and I watched him poke the fire with a long rod. He told me, "Do as I'm doing, or the SS will kill you." I picked up a steel poker and did as he was doing. A steel poker. I obeyed Fischel's order. At that point I was in shock, as if I'd been hypnotized, ready to do whatever I was told. I was so mindless, so horrified, that I did everything Fischel told me. Right, we get also Philipp Müller, who is a very important witness to these events, not only because he was in this particular position in these special details at Auschwitz, but also as part of his work. He had to enter the cremation, he had to enter the cremation chambers. And so he is right there, face to face with these instruments of death, of the Holocaust. And he is now alive to tell the tale, which is just My goodness. I mean, it's I don't, yeah, I can't comment, actually. I'm sorry, I don't have any further comment on that except for what Philip Mueller's actual words are in the film. You know, Claude Lanzmann does something very interesting here too, is that, you know, then we go to, I think it's Munich, and we go to him going to a beer hall in Munich with his camera crew, and he's trying to find someone who was at the camp of Belzec, and this man is named Joseph Oberhauser. Now, this is interesting because we see now Joseph Oberhauser unwilling to make any comments on camera, and he's also a coward. And Claude Lanzmann confronts him. So here we have unlike the interview with Franz Suchomel, we have a situation where Claude Lanzmann is quite openly trying to confront this particular gentleman who obviously does not want to appear on camera and be interviewed on camera. And so this is a very confrontational thing. This is one of the few times, I think, that Lanzmann is openly confrontational with one of his would-be interviewees. So that's an interesting aspect right there. So we already get an insight into how Claude Lanzmann is trying to tackle these particular stories, or not stories, I should say, testimonies from these witnesses. And when he's trying to deal with, obviously when he's dealing with the Jewish witnesses, he has to approach them in a certain way, which is respectful and allowing them to speak as much as possible. But also he has to deal with how to interview the Nazis. And so this is quite an interesting way or an interesting insight into interview technique. And for my money, I think Mr. Lanzmann does a stellar job, an expert job here. And he also does that. He also does the clandestine filming, or the hidden camera technique, with another German whose name is Franz Schalling. And he was a guard who was on duty in Chelmno. And so he was on, I think it was, he was known to be on what was called castle duty. So those of you who are familiar with the Chelmno extermination camp history, you know, there is one phase of the extermination process known as the castle period. And so he also tells us about the process that was employed at Chelmno, which is slightly different from the gas chambers that were employed in places like Treblinka. So here with Chelmno, we have vans, right? We have actual moving vehicles, vans, that were being employed here. Now, this is quite a difficult thing, because, you know, these are we get this later on, which is the Saurer automobile maker made these vans, which were then used by the Nazis to basically kill people, kill Jews that were prisoners in the Chelmno extermination camp. And so it's quite frightening, actually. You know, Mr. Pochlepnik, one of the only two survivors from Chelmno, describes the vans as being, he says, like the ones that deliver cigarettes. They were enclosed with double-leaf rear doors, and Lanzmann asks what color, and Mr. Pochlepnik says the color the Germans used, green, ordinary. Yes, and so the vans become the symbol, and it's the symbol that is one of the most disturbing images, I think, of the film. of a film that contains many disturbing images, I'd say, but this is quite disturbing. And this is disturbing because, you know, it is such an ordinary image, the van, the SHOAH van. And in fact, this first era ends with a discussion, a brief discussion of the vans. And we get the descriptions from, for example, Mr. Simon Shrebnik about the vans and about how he had to, he says, for example, there were 80 people in each van, and he had to wait in a certain area when they arrived, and then he had to open them upon being ordered to by an SS officer. And gosh, he says this, I remember that once they were still alive. The ovens were full and the people lay on the ground. They were all moving. They were coming back to life. And when they were thrown into the ovens, they were all conscious, alive. They could feel the fire burn them. When we built the ovens, I wondered what they were for. An SS man told me to make charcoal for laundry irons. That's what he told me. I didn't know. When the ovens were completed, the logs put in, and the gasoline poured on and lighted, and when the first gas fan arrived, then we knew why the ovens were built. So you see this process, apparently, right? So the vans carried these Jews to a certain location, and they were gassed inside, and then when they arrived, they were dead or near dead. Even if they weren't dead, they were then subjected to being thrown into certain ovens that were constructed. Okay. This is the leads to the memorable lines from Mr. Simon Shrebnik, and let me just read them here. So when I came here to Chelmno, I didn't care about anything. I thought, if I survive, I just want one thing, 5 loaves of bread to eat, that's all. That's what I thought. But I dreamed too that if I survive, I'll be the only one left in the world, not another soul, just me, one. Only me left in the world if I get out of here. This is a very important line in terms of a film's thematic thrust, and this similar kind of expression will occur at the end of the second era. So please just keep this in mind, Mr. Shrebnik's words here. And then also there is a very an incredibly chilling and disturbing internal memo labeled Secret Reich Business from June 5th, 1942. And this is describing certain recommendations from a person whose name is Willy Just. And this is addressed to Walter Rauff with respect to certain recommendations that Just sees to be appropriate with respect to the vans, the SHOAH vans. So he's mentioned 3 general suggestions in order to improve the efficiency of the vans, whose function, as employed by the Nazis, was to murder Jews. Okay, and he's talking about, first of all, the fact that the van's normal load is usually 9 per square yard, etc., etc. So then he says reduction of the load space seems necessary. So the first point that Just is saying here is that he thinks that the load space should be adjusted accordingly in order to accommodate the weight. All right, this number 2 is he suggests here in this memo, the lighting must be better protected. The lamps must be enclosed in a steel grid to prevent their being damaged. Okay, and if we go on, however, it has been observed that when the doors are shut, the load always presses hard against the doors, as soon as the darkness sets in. Notice how the memo describes the people inside as being the load. Okay, the load always presses hard against them. This is because the load naturally rushes towards the light when the darkness sets in, which makes closing the doors difficult. Also, because of the alarming nature of darkness, screaming always occurs when the doors are closed. It would therefore be useful to light the lamp before and during the first moments of the operation. So you see what he's suggesting here, right? The idea of the light being there in order to assuage any sense of panic to the extent possible. And then the third point that Jus says in this memo is, for easy cleaning of the vehicle, there must be a sealed drain in the middle of the floor. The drainage hole's cover, 8 to 12 inches in diameter, would be equipped with a slanting trap so that fluid liquids can drain off during the operation. During cleaning, the drain can be used to evacuate large pieces of dirt. All right. So here we have descriptions from certain places with respect to the actual killing process. And we see the approach by the Germans with respect to this killing process. Okay. Before I move on, I'd like to mention one point here about this end of the First Era. Now, the First Era also has interviews with certain villagers from this village of Grabau. It also has, as I mentioned in the previous video, interviews with certain villagers, for example, in Treblinka. Memorably, Mr. Borowy, the man with the red T-shirt or the red shirt, and he has a very fat belly. And but also we get and then the interviews with the villagers in Grabau, for example, tend to be or tend to reveal a certain attitude that these particular people had and apparently still have towards the Jewish person, the Jewish population. Then we get also a certain sequence where Simon Trebnik is surrounded by villagers in a town square in the town of Kelno itself, in front of a church. And this is one of the famous scenes in the film, because we see, first of all, that these people are very happy to see Simon Trebnik alive. But then soon after, they start to talk to Claude Lanzmann, who is apparently off screen. And they begin to reveal certain, or they mention certain comments that reveals their attitudes, which is really quite stunning. The sort of the lack of sort of understanding of how grave the situation was. And Simon Trebnik is standing right there, and there's a point where they're talking and the camera just zooms into Mr. Trebnik's face, and it's just, I don't know what's being registered in that face. Maybe it's shock, or maybe it's just nothing at all. Maybe he's turning it off in his mind. I don't know. It's there's so much to read in that face, which is at once so full of feeling and emotion, and at the same time registers nothing. It's just a powerful sequence, and it's just another example of the way in which Mr. Lanzmann is a master interviewer, and how he is able to get these people to talk. I mean, he's not forcing them to speak. He doesn't force them to speak at all, but there's no they are in their home ground, as it were. He is visiting them. There's no foreign environment for them, and it's all in a natural setting, and there's a church behind them, and at one point the interview is interrupted because of certain church proceedings, but then people then want to speak to him. It's not like he's forcing them to. No, people want to speak to him, and there's a particular man who then comes out. He's a little bit balding and has glasses, and he comes out and he actually talks unsolicited, initially, but then he talks very quite frankly, which is a little bit surprising. He's the one who says, yes, the Jews, right? The Jews there were gathered in, or his comments are interpreted to say, the Jews there were gathered in a square. The rabbi asked an SSS man, "Can I talk to them?" The SSS man says, "Yes." So the rabbi said that around 2,000 years ago, the Jews condemned the innocent Christ to death. And when they did that, they cried out, "Let his blood fall on our heads and on our sons' heads." Then the rabbi told them, "Perhaps the time has come for that. So let us do nothing. Let us go. Let us do as we're asked." And then Claude Lanzmann asks, so he thinks the Jews expiated the death of Christ. And then the gentleman's comments are interpreted to say, he doesn't think so, or even that Christ sought revenge. He didn't say that. The rabbi said it. It was God's will. That's all. These sequences tend to go towards a general critique against the film, namely Claude Lanzmann's approach towards the Polish people who are being interviewed. And these scenes are, I think, cited very commonly when making such a critique. Now, I think I've mentioned in an earlier video that I don't necessarily believe that such critique is I don't know if it's really accurate, given that there are other Polish interviewees who are interviewed by Mr. Lanzmann and featured in the film SHOAH that seem to be given much deference and respect by Mr. Lanzmann as he is questioning them and interviewing them. So, please consider that if you are a proponent of such critique against the film. So then I'd like now to talk very briefly about the second era of the film, which is the latter half of the film. So it's about 4 hours, 5 hours. And here we get obviously a continuation of the interviews, some of the interviews that were had in the first era. Now we get we get Franz Suchomel again from Treblinka, and after singing a song, he talks about the Lanzmann tries to ask him about how many Jews were killed during the peak of Treblinka, and Lanzmann asks, how was it possible in Treblinka in peak days to process 18,000 people? And then Suchomel says, 18,000 is too high. And Lanzmann says, but I read that figure in court reports. To process 18,000 people, to liquidate them. And then Suchomel says, Mr. Lanzmann, that's an exaggeration, believe me. So Suchomel says, 18,000 people being killed is an exaggeration. 18,000 is exaggeration. So then Lanzmann replies, how many then? And then Suchomel says, 12,000 to 15,000. Right, so 18,000 is exaggeration, but to be more accurate, one should have said 12,000 to 15,000. Okay, so this is quite a, I'm not going to make any further comment here. I think you probably know, or you can probably sense how I feel about this. So this is also a discussion about the actual process of the killing of the Jews in Treblinka, and how they were the Jews that were picked to be killed were ordered to walk through this sort of constructed funnel. I think it's called what is it? Is it the Schlau, the Schlauch, or the funnel, and it was sometimes referred to as the Himmelweg, the road to heaven, and I think it was referred to this by the Germans actually. And here we get again the process of how the Jews were killed at Treblinka. So they were first ordered to walk through this funnel, and they were, right, let's see, yes. Yes, and then here we get a description by SHOAH about how those people had to take off their clothes, so they were naked, and he's talking about how the men were whipped by the guards and the women weren't whipped. I'm not sure as a kind of, I'm not sure what that means. And then they were forced into the gas chambers. Now, then we get one of the most celebrated sequences of the film, which is Abraham Bomba, one of the survivors of Treblinka, and he is performing cutting of hair of a certain gentleman who's sitting in a chair in a barber shop. Now, if you read this book, you'll get information about how this particular sequence actually was basically a setup, right? Apparently Landsman arranged to rent a certain barbershop. He rented a barbershop, and he asked Abraham Bomba to do a haircut while he was being interviewed. And the reason why this is quite significant is because as he is doing this haircut, he is being interviewed by Landsman, and he is talking about how he had to cut the hair of these people, these Jewish people, before they were gassed. And he had very limited time, and there were other barbers there performing the same duty. And so this was quite, and they were naked, and this was the kind of the last thing that would happen to these people until then they were gassed and then killed and murdered. So and then Abraham Bomba then talks about how one of his friends who worked as a barber, let me say here, so a friend of mine worked as a barber. He was a good barber in my hometown, and his hometown being Czestochowa. So Abraham Bomba's hometown was Czestochowa, and he says, a friend of mine worked as a barber. He was a good barber in my hometown. When his wife and his sister came into the gas chamber, and then he stops there, and Abraham Bomba breaks down. And this is quite a significant moment, because up to now, we haven't seen Abraham Bomba be or show this level of emotion before. After he regains his composure, he says, they tried to talk to him and the husband of his sister, and they could not tell them this was the last time that they stay alive, because behind them was the German Nazis, SS men, and they knew that if they said a word, not only the wife and the woman, who were dead already, but also they would share the same thing with them. Right? So he's talking basically about the barbers, right, who are cutting the hair. And the barbers couldn't say anything directly to these people, because the SS men were behind them. So if the barber said anything to them, then the barbers themselves would be killed. Right? But in a way, Bomba says, they tried to do the best for them with a second longer, a minute longer, just to hug them and kiss them, because they knew they would never see them again. So this is we have Abraham Bomba, who is cutting hair, talking about how he had to cut the hair of the Jewish people before they were killed in the gas chambers at Treblinka. And he is recalling one particular moment about the wife or the family, the wife and sister of a dear friend of his. Treblinka is given, of course, a lot of attention by Claude Lanzmann and his interviewees. We also get another survivor of Treblinka, which is Mr. Richard Glauser, and he has the beard. And he talks not about the gas chamber or the Himmelweg, but he also talks about Richard Glauser instead talks about what is known as, what's the word, lazaret, and this means infirmary. So infirmary should be in air quotes, because it wasn't really an infirmary. This is just another part of the camp that was used to kill Jews, but it was called the infirmary or the lazaret, which is quite a terrible name, actually, because it was anything but. Richard Glauser talks about how there was this infirmary, and I understand that those people who came to the camp who were, let's say, elderly, who were weak physically, or maybe they were young children, they went to the lazaret and the infirmary, and Richard Glauser describes it. The infirmary was a narrow site very close to the ramp to which the aged were led. I had to do this too. This execution site wasn't covered, just an open place with no roof, but screened by a fence so no one could see in. The way in was a narrow passage, very short but somewhat similar to the funnel, a sort of tiny labyrinth. In the middle of it was a pit, and to the left, as one came in, there was a little booth with a kind of wooden plank in it, like a springboard. If people were too weak to stand on it, they'd have to sit on it. And then, as the saying went in Treblinka jargon, SS men Miete would, quote, cure each one with a single pill. A shot in the neck. In peak periods, this happened daily. In those days, the pit, and it was at least 10 to 12 feet deep, was full of corpses. So we get this horrible phrase. So this SS man would cure each one with a single pill, which is a gunshot, a bullet to the neck. And this was the execution process in the lazaret at Treblinka. At this point, we go back and forth. So we have talked now about Treblinka, and then we go back to Auschwitz. And then for that, we hear the testimonies, once again, of Mr. Rudolf Brah and then Philipp Müller. Now, Rudolf Brah talks about how he makes a very memorable comment about how the Germans use the phrase Lauschschritt, which means running. Lauschschritt, yes, never walking. Everything had to be done in Laufschritt, immer laufen, so very sporty. They are a sporty nation, you see. So you can see the and then Philipp Müller talks in quite chilling detail about the gas chambers in Auschwitz. Now, this is quite a difficult part of the film, in a film that has many difficult moments, but this is also one of the most famous parts of the film, and it's famous because of the description with which Philipp Müller describes the gas chamber. Philipp Müller now talks about the gas chamber at Auschwitz, and he says, you see, once the gas was poured in, it worked like this. It rose from the ground upwards, and in the terrible struggle that followed, because it was a struggle, the lights were switched off in the gas chambers. It was dark, no one could see, so the strongest people tried to climb higher, because they probably realized that the higher they got, the more air there was. They could breathe better. That caused the struggle. Secondly, most people tried to push their way to the door. It was psychological. They knew where the door was. Maybe they could force their way out. It was instinctive, a death struggle, which is why children and weaker people and the aged always wound up at the bottom. The strongest were on top, because in the death struggle, a father didn't realize his son lay beneath him. And then Landsman asks, and then when the doors were opened, and then Mr. Mueller replies, they fell out. People fell out like blocks of stone, like rocks falling out of a truck. But near the Zyklon gas, there was a void. There was no one where the gas crystals went in, an empty space. Probably the victims realized that the gas worked strongest there. The people were battered. They struggled and fought in the darkness. They were covered in excrement, in blood, from ears and noses. One also sometimes saw that the people lying on the ground, because of the pressure of the others, were unrecognizable. Children had their skulls crushed. Yes, vomit, blood from the ears and noses, probably even menstrual fluid. I'm sure of it. There was everything in that struggle for life, that death struggle. It was terrible to see. That was the toughest part. Yes. So we have very descriptive testimonies here from various people, various participants, various witnesses regarding Treblinka and Auschwitz thus far. And then we now move to a different part of the world. And now we go to Corfu. And this is very interesting because now we get interviews of Jewish people in Corfu who were sent to concentration camps. So we get Mr. Moshe Mordo, who was sent to Auschwitz, and he talks about how his family were killed. And he is the gentleman, if you know, he has that little piece of paper, and it has the drawings, and he folds it in a certain way, and it forms Hitler's face. That's amazing. That's just one of the most, I can't get that image out of my mind for some reason. And we also get interviews with Armando Aron, and I think he speaks French, and there are other 4 people with him. And so he is talking in French, I think, with Claude Landsman directly, about how there were Jews in Corfu who were rounded up, and then from there they were transported by the trains. So this, and he's talking about the journey of these Jews in Corfu, out of Corfu and into Europe. Into the extermination camps. And this now leads to a discussion of the railways and the trains, which is an interesting thing. And we get another, his name is Walter Stier, and he's described as an ex-member of the Nazi Party and former head of the Reich Railways Department 33 of the Nazi Party. So he's talking about how he's talking about the trains. And at one point, this ex-Nazi is asked by Mr. Landsman, did you know that Treblinka meant extermination? And then he says, of course not. Good God, no. How could we know? I never went to Treblinka. I stayed in Krakow, in Warsaw, glued to my desk. I was strictly a bureaucrat. So Walter Stier, he seems to have, or he says to us that he had no knowledge at the time with respect to the meaning of Treblinka as a place of death. Okay, now we get, with respect to the trains, an interesting exchange from a historian, right, whose name is Raoul Hilberg. Now, Raoul Hilberg is the historian who wrote the famous text called The Destruction of the European Jews. And he's talking about a particular aspect of the trains. He talks about how he brings up really fascinating aspects about the trains and about how certain things, about the payments, how certain payments needed to be made to the railways by the Germans, and there were some issues with respect to payments that could not be made because of currency issues. There was also the idea of how the payments that were made, this is just, I can't even begin to comprehend this fully, but the Nazis confiscated Jewish property that was then used to pay for the transports by these trains of the Jewish people to the various extermination camps. So you see what that means. You see that the Jewish people paid for their own transport, so to speak, which is just it angers me so much just to think of that particular scenario. But in particular, Mr. Hilberg, as a historian, I think is given much deference by Claude Lanzmann when Claude Lanzmann is interviewing him at this particular moment in the film. And I think rightly so, because Mr. Hilberg has a very clear way of presenting, and it's very precise and very easy to understand. And he talks in particular about a particular piece of paper, which it seems to be like an internal memo or written order, and it's called the Fahrplanen Ordnung 587. This Fahrplanen Ordnung has certain descriptions with respect to particular trains and their schedules and their stops, etc. So we get an example here of a typical train that, according to Mr. Hilberg's description of this piece of paper, was with respect to a particular train for transports to be made during September 1942. And then we get certain details about how the trains were used very with chilling efficiency, and that they were used quite frequently within a short space of time. Okay, so this is a very interesting part of the film. Now, I bring this up specifically here because I think this is one part which I admit I'm not quite sure of, because now maybe some of you who know the film better than I will know the answer to this, but I don't understand one particular aspect of Mr. Hilberg's description of this Fahrplanen Ordnung 587, because he says, he talks about it as death traffic. And then he says, here we see that the starting out in one ghetto, which is obviously being emptied, the train leaves for Treblinka. It leaves on the 30th of September, 30, September 1942. 18 minutes after 4 o'clock, by the schedule at least, and arrives there at 11:24 on the next morning. Now, once the train has been unloaded at Treblinka, let's see, and you notice that there are two numbers here, 11:24, that's in the morning, and 15:59, which is to say almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In that interval of time, the train has to be unloaded, cleaned, and turned around. And you see here the same numbers appear as the Leerzug, the now empty train, goes to another place, and it leaves at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and goes now to that other place, which is yet another small town where it picks up victims, and there you are at 3 o'clock in the morning. It leaves on the 23rd at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it arrives there the next day. So he describes in great detail this particular piece of paper, which seems to set forth a very strict schedule for delivery of Jewish people who are being transported to Treblinka, and then using that train again and going back out, and then getting more Jews and then bringing them back to Treblinka. The one thing I just don't understand is that he describes the first aspect of this transport as being leaving from Treblinka on the 30th of September, 30 September. But then he says very shortly after that the same train, I think it's the same train, goes to another place and picks up more victims at 3 o'clock in the morning at that place, and then it leaves that place on the 23rd. Now this seems to be the 23rd of September, because he then says later, immediately after then it goes back to Treblinka, and this is again a long trip, and it now goes back to yet another place, the same situation, the same trip, and then yet another, goes to Treblinka, and then arrives at Częstochowa, the 29th of September, and then the cycle is complete. So apparently he's talking about the same train, but he says he starts out with the train leaving for Treblinka, or leaves on the 30th of September, and then it makes some trips and then comes back, goes to Treblinka, and then arrives in Częstochowa on the 29th of September. So I don't know how the same train could have left one place first on the 30th of September, but then later arrives at a place on the 29th of September. And I don't believe that this is a year-round trip that's being described. I think the point of this passage is to show the efficiency and the short amount of time that one train undergoes with respect to certain transports. So I don't know why the 30th September is mentioned here by Mr. Hilberg with respect to Fahrplananordnung 587. But if you have any insights on that, I'd like to know. I have never seen the piece of paper or a copy of which fully, so I can't really comment on that. So, but that's, I think, just a minor point. I think the major point is something we should not lose sight of, which is the idea that Mr. Hilberg is evoking here, which is the chilling efficiency of the trains. Let me just now move on to another aspect that's discussed in the second era part of SHOAH, which is the Auschwitz camp and the period of the history of the Auschwitz camp where the Jewish people from the ghetto of Theresienstadt arrive. Now, this is a pretty significant point of the history of the Auschwitz camp, and this is described by Ruth Elias, and also by Rudolf Bra, and also by Philipp Müller. Now, just to be very brief, so the Jews from Theresienstadt arrive to the camp, and they are afforded apparently slightly better treatment than the Jews that were already there. And for example, the families were permitted to stay together rather than be separated, and they were apparently living in a different part of the camp, so it was separated between those Jews from the Theresienstadt ghetto and the Jews that were already in Auschwitz. I think Rudolf Bra describes it as being 2A and 2B. Yes, and yes, the Czech Jews from Theresienstadt came into one particular part of the camp, which was called Baubschnitt 2B. At the time, I was working as a registrar in 2A. Okay. So this is very significant because they were fed relatively better, and the death rate was somewhat lower than the death rate of the rest of the camp in terms of, and when I say death rate, I mean death rate from sickness or from exhaustion or from other reasons other than being killed in the gas chambers or by execution. So, and this is all described by Mr. Vra. So therefore, there's this idea of how this might be the timing that the resistance in the Auschwitz camp was looking for in order to try to organize, because we have these Theresienstadt Jews who came in who probably have a little bit higher or stronger morale and stronger physical strength than those who are still in Auschwitz, or those who are already in Auschwitz, excuse me. And then there comes a point where it would appear that the Theresienstadt Jews were told by the Nazis that they were being moved out to a different camp, where in fact, no, they weren't going to be transported, but this was just a lie to tell to the Theresienstadt Jews that this is a lie that was told to them in order to trick them and to lull them into a sense of false relief, because in fact they were going to be killed. And this is about 6 months after their arrival. So there's this idea about how this timing should have, Mr. Rudolf Bra was talking about how the resistance was trying to take advantage of this timing, right? And how he was trying to convince one particular person who was kind of a spiritual leader amongst the Theresienstadt Jews, and in particular very close to the children, whose name was Freddie Hirsch. Now, Rudolf Bra describes his conversation with Freddie Hirsch and tries to convince him about how right it is to try to organize and lead this kind of uprising in the camp, and trying to escape, that would be the objective of the uprising. And then Freddie Hirsch asked what about the children, because Freddie Hirsch was very close to the children. He was a young man of 30 or 31, 32, so in his early 30s. And but Rudolf Brahe very coldly and ruthlessly says that the children have to die because there's no way that they could help the children. And from Rudolf Brahe's point of view, it was it's either everyone dies, including the children, or we do this where the children will die, but at least some other Jews in the camp will have a chance to live. So that was the calculation that Rudolf Brahe faced, which is just a yes. So Rudolf Brahe then describes how Freddie Hirsch was asked to be left alone to think about it, and then after some time had passed and Rudolf Brahe returned to where he was, he found that Freddie Hirsch had tried to commit suicide by swallowing some kind of overdose. But he wasn't dead. He wasn't quite dead yet. So then Rudolf Brahe tried to call it maybe a friend who had medical expertise and tried to save him. But then it was decided between them, according to Mr. Brahe, that they should let him die because if they did save him, he would just be in kind of a weakened state physically. And if he was in such a state, then the Germans would just then kill him anyway. So they just decided to let him die rather than save him, upon him attempting suicide the way he did. So then apparently he died, upon committing suicide. So this is the sort of, and then based on this episode, Mr. Rudolf Brahe describes how he then decided to, along with one other person, escape from Auschwitz, in which he did. But the film does not focus on the escape. This is very important. The film only focuses on Rudolf Brahe's conviction about how he wanted to escape, and that was it. Now, I think this is very important because the film does not give us a description of his escape, because the film is not about this idea of hope. No, I mean it's one of those just remarkable aspects of history, and Rudolf Brahe. I can't even begin to fathom that kind of effort and luck and just fortitude that must have taken. And so you can see how that kind of story might be considered almost, inspiring perhaps. But the fact that it's omitted from this film, SHOAH, is very important, because that means that the point of SHOAH is not, as I said in an earlier video, it's not to show a complete history of the Holocaust, and it's not to show a comprehensive history of the Holocaust. It is not to show any of the kind of the acts of heroism, so to speak, that might be considered to be inspiring events of history with respect to the Holocaust. No. The focus of SHOAH is death. The focus of SHOAH is death, and how these people react in the face of death, almost certain death, a special kind of death, a total annihilation and eradication and obliteration. That's the point of this film. And so we don't get Rudolf Brahe's description of his escape. And also, incidentally, we don't get Yehuda Lerner's description of his escape from Sobibor. That's the point of one of the supplements of the release by the Criterion Collection. The film Sobibor, October 14th, 1943, 4 p.m. So that's the film where Mr. Landsman interviews Yehuda Lerner, who was involved with the uprising at Sobibor, and who was successful in escaping upon participating in that uprising. But that is a very, that is a tale of great kind of horror and heroism. But again, that's not part of this particular point of SHOAH, which again is a film about death. Rudolf Brahe, we leave him saying how he wanted to escape in order to contact the outside world. And then this is a link to Mr. Jan Karski. And Mr. Jan Karski's very memorable interview here. Apparently, Mr. Landsman interviewed Jan Karski over the course of 2 days, but what appears in the film is the interview of that first day. And in fact, the interview from the second day appears in a film that is called the Karski Report, which is also a supplement on the Criterion Collection release. And so Jan Karski is very important because he is a sort of he acted as a courier. He had to. It was a very dangerous thing that he did. If he was, it could have meant his death if he made one wrong move. So it was a very dangerous thing and very brave thing that he did. Obviously, was trying to transmit messages, to the Polish government in exile, and part of his mission to do that, or he was asked as part of his mission, was to try to convince the outside world to provide more assistance with respect to directly to the Holocaust and what was happening. And part of that mission was therefore for him to visit the Warsaw Ghetto and to see firsthand the conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. So he very he's quite he's a very he's got just a very memorable interview. He has a certain way about his expressions and his speech, which is so captivating. But he is an eyewitness to the Warsaw Ghetto, and he sees the horror of the Warsaw Ghetto. And this leads us, therefore, to the Warsaw Ghetto, which is probably the final main component of SHOAH and a discussion of the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is, I think, in divided into some parts. So the first part of this discussion is basically this. First of all, another Nazi who's being interviewed. His name is Franz Grassler. He was the deputy to Dr. Auerswald, who was the commissioner of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Nazi commissioner of the Warsaw Ghetto. So Franz Grassler was the number two. He was the deputy. So, Franz Grassler is being interviewed by Landsman, and it's so interesting how little Franz Grassler says he knows or he knew at the time. It's quite interesting. He seems to forget a lot. So he asks during his interview if he's allowed to take notes, because some of this stuff is interesting to him as well. He gets some of his facts a little bit wrong, but that's okay because he likes climbing apparently, and so after the war, apparently Franz Grassler. I just want to get this right. Yeah, he wrote published mountain guidebooks after the war because he likes climbing. Anyway, so he was the deputy to Dr. Auerswald, who was the Nazi commissioner of the Warsaw Ghetto. But also what we get here is this is contrasted with, again, Mr. Raoul Hilberg, the great historian, who is talking about the head of the Jewish Council of the Warsaw Ghetto, and this is Adam Czerniako. Now, Czerniako left a diary, and this diary was very important. Now, Mr. Hilberg describes these diary passages, or the key diary passages, and this shows us basically a first-hand account of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto in this diary, which is a fascinating account in many respects. And Raoul Hilberg shows us how important this diary is by Czerniako. And these descriptions in the Czerniako diary as described by Raoul Hilberg gravely contrast with the descriptions by Mr. Grassler or Franz Grassler, the Nazi. So, for example, Grassler says, he seldom went into the ghetto, and he says that the conditions in the ghetto were appalling. And when Landsman asks him about typhus, Grassler says, "I'm not a doctor. I only know that typhus is a very dangerous epidemic that wipes people out like the plague." And then Landsman asks, "Why was there typhus in the ghetto?" And then Grassler says, "I don't know if there was, but there was a danger because of the famine." Okay. Raoul Hilberg then discusses Adam Chernyako's diary, and he talks about the wall that Dr. Oswald wanted to have built around the ghetto in order to protect the Germans outside of the ghetto from contracting typhus that was running rampant within the ghetto because of the horrible conditions here. So then there's this episode which is memorialized in the Chernyako diary about how Oswald wanted a wall built in order to protect the German population around the periphery of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Oswald made a demand to Chernyako that the Jewish people pay for the wall. Now, this is something where Raoul Hilberg describes it as being, Adam Chernyaco, who's normally not very aggressive. This is the one time that he displays direct kind of, he shows resistance against Dr. Oswald. Because, he says, Raoul Hilberg says, "He very seldom argues with the Germans. He pleads, he appeals, but he doesn't argue with them. He does argue when he's forced not only to build the wall, but to pay for it. And he says that if the wall is being put up as a hygienic measure to prevent Jewish epidemics from engulfing the Polish or German population outside, then why is it that the Jews have to pay for it? The people who get the protection should be paying for the medicine. If the wall is medicine, let the Germans pay." And Oswald, the ghetto commissar, says that's a very nice argument that he, Chernyaco, might bring up at an international conference someday, but for now, he'll pay for the wall. Yes. So, this is quite a remarkable sequence in the film. This contrast between Franz Grassler on the one hand and Raoul Hilberg's description of Adam Chernyako's diary on the other hand. It's just as a piece of film, this is quite stunning, incredibly effective, and again. Claude Landsman's skills as an interviewer, interviewing Franz Grassler here are just nothing short of masterful. It's nothing short of masterful. This is quite a remarkable interview that he is conducting, both with Raoul Hilberg on the one hand and Franz Grassler on the other hand. It's incredible. Then. This is very interesting because I just want to make this one point and then I'll move on about Adam Chernyaco as described by Raoul Hilberg. Adam Chernyaco committed suicide. Let's see. According to the question by Landsman, Landsman says the first transport of the Jews of Warsaw for Treblinka was the 22nd of July, 1942, and he, meaning Chernyaco, committed suicide the day after. So Chernyaco committed suicide on the 23rd of July, 1942. And this is very, very, this is one of the most, this is one of the toughest things of the film for me. Very similar to the reaction of Freddie Hirsch, regarding the Auschwitz and the Theresienstadt ghetto Jews, Freddie Hirsch and his devotion to the children, if you recall, and then he commits suicide because Rudolf Bra reminds him that there is no hope for saving the children. The same thing here with Chernyasko. Chernyasko is described as being very close to the orphans in the Warsaw Ghetto because, according to Hilberg's understanding, the orphans have no one. And so Chernyasko sees them, he looks after them and wants to care for them. But then when Chernyasko realizes that there is no hope for these Jews and that they are being transported to these places of death, in this case Treblinka, he realizes that he has no power to save these children, these orphans who have no one there in the world to help them. And once the first transport leaves, he kills himself the next day. Raoul Hilberg then says, if he cannot take care of the children, what else can he do? Some people report that he wrote a note after he closed the book on the diary in which he said, they want me to kill the children with my own hands. Okay. So, yes, this is the Warsaw Ghetto. And then we get the Gertrude Schneider and her mother, who are two survivors from the ghetto. And they provide a very, maybe all too brief, but memorable appearance in the film. Quite memorable. And then we get the final sequence of the film, which is a set of interviews from members of the JCO, the Jewish Combat Organization. So we have Itzhak Zuckerman, who is the man with the mustache, who has the very famous line, which is interpreted, which is, if you could lick my heart, it would poison you. Yes, so, Itzhak Zuckerman apparently was able to leave the ghetto some days before the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto took place. So he apparently was able to survive the grueling, horrific attack on the ghetto. And then there's the last interviewee in the film, whose name is Simha Rotem, who is also here in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he describes how he was, I think, sent on a mission, JCO mission, to go out and then try to find certain people outside of the ghetto, what he called the Aryan section of Warsaw, Aryan Warsaw, and then come back. So then, he also had to try to contact, I think it was Itzhak Zuckerman, amongst other people. And then he tries to go in, but go back into the ghetto of Warsaw. But by the time he tries to go back in, the attack by the Germans to suppress the uprising has already occurred, or is occurring, or has already occurred, excuse me. And so he goes back, and he describes, this is kind of a very hellish scene, back inside the walls of the ghetto, and he couldn't find the people in the ghetto. He tried to go to certain places with the password, but there would be no answer. And he says all the houses were in ruins, and I heard only one voice. I thought some evil spell had been cast on me, a woman's voice talking from the rubble. I circled the ruins. I didn't look at my watch, but I must have spent a half hour exploring, trying to find the woman whose voice guided me, but unfortunately I didn't find her. And then we get more descriptions. And then the last lines of the film, which are, I was alone all the time. And this is all interpreted, by the way. But I was alone all the time, except for that woman's voice, and a man I met as I came out of the sewers. I was alone throughout my tour of the ghetto. I didn't meet a living soul. At one point, I recall feeling a kind of peace, of serenity. I said to myself, I'm the last Jew. I'll wait for morning and for the Germans. So, and this is the end of the interviews of the film. And then the film then ends with a shot of the train. And I'm not quite sure, but it seems to my eye to be the train of Treblinka. That seems to be the Treblinka train, although I'm not quite sure because it doesn't seem to be good. But it seems to match the Treblinka train footage that was seen in the first half of the film. And then that's how the film ends. Okay. So this is very interesting because Simha Rotem's last words about how I am the last Jew, right? These echo very strongly the words of Simon Trebnik at the end of the first era, right? Where he says, let me just get the words here. Yes, I dreamed too that if I survive, I'll be the only one left in the world, not another soul, just me, one, only me left in the world if I get out of here. So the end of the first era of the film is the end of the last interview of the first era of Shoah is Simon Trebnik's words there. And here, ending the second era, is the interview with Mr. Rotem and his words about how he says, I am the last Jew. I'll wait for morning and for the Germans. So there is a purposeful structure here that is being employed by Claude Lanzmann as a filmmaker, not just as a kind of an interviewer or documentarian. No, this is a film. This is a film with a very purposeful structure, right? Because we go, for example, talking about the second era. In as a whole, we start, remember, with Franz Suchomel talking about the specifics of Treblinka. Then we go to Abraham Bomba, who's talking about the specifics of Treblinka, and then we go back and forth between them. And then we go then to Richard Glauser talking about the Lazarette, and then we go through more discussions of. Let's see. There we go. I think to Philip Mueller, and then. Discussions of Auschwitz, shifting to Auschwitz, and then Rudolf Bra, and then talking about Corfu, and then from Corfu we talk about the transport of Jews, and then from the transport of Jews we talk about the transport of Jews from Corfu, which leads to discussion of the railroads and the trains, and then the discussion of the transports, and then the lack of transports and what that meant to the camps for Treblinka, according to Richard Glauser. Treblinka, and also according to Philip Mueller and Rudolf Bra at Auschwitz, and then that leads into a discussion of the Theresienstadt Jews, or the Jews from the Theresienstadt ghetto coming into Auschwitz, and then the potential for uprising, and then Rudolf Bra deciding to leave and trying to inform the world, which then leads to a discussion by Jan Karski, who was a man who was on the mission to inform the world about the plight of the Polish people, but also about the Holocaust. And then that part of his mission was to tell what he had seen in the Warsaw Ghetto, which then leads to a discussion of a Warsaw Ghetto as provided by Franz Grassler, deputy to Dr. Oswald, and then also by Raoul Hilberg, who provides insight into the diary of Adam Chernyako, the head of the Jewish Council in Warsaw. And then that leads to then a discussion of the Warsaw Uprising, or at least some aspects of the Warsaw Uprising, and then that ends the film. So there is and then the ending of the film mirrors the ending of the ending of the second era mirrors the ending of the first era. So there we have a very purposeful through line that is being employed here by Claude Lanzmann masterfully and with such brilliance and confidence that it's stunning that the structure he was able to find the structure amongst the hours and hours and hours and hours of footage that he must have had. It's just amazing. So that is my discussion of this film. I apologize for my kind of hectic nature, but I think, again, this is such an important film to discuss, and I just wanted to be sure that it was done right with certain details that weren't left behind. So I hope I didn't I hope it wasn't too strenuous for you, for those of you who are still watching these videos. Thank you very much for sticking with me to the end. I really appreciate it. It means a lot, because this film is so important and it should be seen by everyone. Just very quickly, I just wanted to mention that this is the Criterion Collection release, Spine 663. This happens to be the Blu-ray release of this film. This has certain special features, of course, such as a conversation between Landsman and critic Serge Tobiana. And then there's also an interview with Caroline Champentier, assistant camera person on SHOAH, and filmmaker Arnold Desplechin. And there's also a trailer, and there's also an essay book. And as I said, this essay book is quite interesting because it has an essay which is Here There Is No Why by Claude Landsman, which is actually a reprint from the essay that as it appears in this book, Claude Landsman's SHOAH. And again, I recommend that you get this book as a means of supplementing your study of this book. And the essay appears here in the German title, Hier ist kein Warum. And so, yes, what else does this have? Yes, there's also an essay here by Landsman called From the Holocaust to Holocaust. This is a very interesting essay as well. This was originally published in June 1979 in an issue of Le Temps Moderne. And then English translation was published subsequently. So those are the two essays in this Criterion Collection release. But of course that's not all, because the Criterion Collection release also has 3 films. One is A Visitor from the Living, and the other is the film Sobibor, October 14th, 1943, 4 p.m. And then the other is the film The Karski Report. Now, these films are basically essentially, each film is essentially an edited form of certain footage that was shot for SHOAH, but was not ultimately used in SHOAH. And each film, I think, is quite important in respectively. But if you don't mind, I'd like to save my discussions and comments of those films for separate videos in the future. I think each film is quite important, and I don't want to go over with my time. I'd rather take the time with a proper separate video for each of those films, because they are quite important. I should also say that I also have the Eureka Masters of Cinema UK release. So this is a Region B Blu-ray release of SHOAH, and this is quite significant too, because it does have the films SHOAH, of course, and then it has A Visitor from the Living, and then it has Sobibor, October 14th, 1943, 4 p.m. And it also has the Karski Report. So these 3 films also appear as supplements on the Criterion Collection release. However, the Eureka Masters of Cinema also has one more film, which is called The Last of the Unjust. Now, this is also a very, I think, quite a key film, actually. It's Benjamin Murmelstein, and his connection with Theresienstadt. So if you don't mind, I'd like to reserve time in another video to talk about The Last of the Unjust, but it is a very important film as well. Now, this release from Masters of Cinema, I should mention, has this book, and among the many things that I think are really great about this book, it does have an introduction to SHOAH by Stuart Liebman, which in fact is a reprint from the introduction by Stuart Liebman in this book. You know, Stuart Liebman is the editor on this book, which I recommend that you get. So this is very great. I really like this essay because it provides a very, very good background into the film. And in fact, I would suggest that I would suggest that you read the Stuart Liebman introduction if you can before watching the film SHOAH. One of the things that's very interesting about this about what Mr. Liebman says is about the meaning of the word SHOAH. You know, a lot of people, let's say online and on online articles and descriptions of SHOAH say that SHOAH means the Holocaust. But I realized that after reading Mr. Liebman's essay that it's not quite as simple as that. I mean, I don't know Hebrew, and I'm not a student of Bible studies, and I don't know the Hebrew Bible very well at all. But according to Mr. Liebman, it says here, SHOAH conveys something of the essence of Lanzmann's project as it crystallized. The word appears 13 times in the Hebrew Bible, where it consistently refers to the ravages of a natural disaster like an earthquake or a flood. By the mid-1940s, however, the word had increasingly become central to pre-state and later Israeli public discourse about the catastrophe that had engulfed the European Jewish diaspora. Its original reference had already begun to expand to include the catastrophe, destruction, or annihilation wrought by the Nazis. Lanzmann, however, did not simply adopt the biblical term, nor did he embrace ordinary Israeli usage. Rather, as he later wrote, for him, SHOAH was a signifier without a signified, a brief, opaque utterance, an impenetrable word, as unsmashable as an atomic nucleus. So for Lanzmann, the word's opacity for all non-speakers of Hebrew poses a challenge to discern the scope and meaning of its reference. Its foreignness casts a kind of numinous remoteness on the events to which it refers, making them impervious to ready comprehension. So that is a very interesting description by Mr. Liebman in his essay on the introduction to Claude Lanzmann's SHOAH. That's a very interesting description with respect to SHOAH, the word itself, and its meaning. So it doesn't, it's not, I don't know if it's necessarily true that it means Holocaust, because it apparently does have a usage as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, which doesn't necessarily refer to, you know, the kind of the destruction of or annihilation that the word Holocaust to us anyway now implies. So that's an interesting discussion. I'm sorry, but yes. So this book by the Masters of Cinema, has that essay, and it also has a, where is it? Yes, it also has a great, very informative transcript from April 11th, 1990, which is called A Seminar with Claude Lanzmann, which is organized by David Roderick at Yale University in 1990 and published in Yale French Studies the following year. So this is very good. Yale, so my alma mater. And this is a really fascinating, it's just so much information that's packed in here. It's just incredible. And then there are essays that are devoted to each of the supplemental films. So there's one essay called Theresienstadt, A Farther Image, A Closer Word, on the subject of A Visitor from the Living, right? Because the film A Visitor from the Living is about Maurice Rossel and his famous or infamous visit to the Theresienstadt ghetto. And then there's another essay which is called Sobibor, October 14, 1943, 4 p.m. And this is about that film. So on the hero of Sobibor by Lawrence Giavarini. So this is just just a rich resource about this film. And again, I will devote another video to this. But this is just in many ways such a stunning film. Sobibor, such a stunning film. And then there's another essay about the Karski Report, which is called Lanzmann, Reader, on the subject of the Karski Report by Alexander Jocelyn, which is also a very fascinating essay. And then the last essay on the last film, The Last of the Unjust, is called Faces of Claude Lanzmann by Emmanuel Berdo. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I neglected to mention that the first essay about on the subject of A Visitor from the Living is by Alexander Josselin. Okay, so this is actually quite. Oh, I'm sorry. And then also there is an interview with Claude Lanzmann on The Last of the Unjust, which is included here. And then there's also a brief biography on Claude Lanzmann that is included at the very end. So in fact, I would say that this essay from the Masters of Cinema is a little bit more, has a little bit more information, or different information at least, than the Criterion Collection booklet. So if you want to be even more complete, as it were, I would suggest that you get this and this, as well as getting at least this book and getting the complete text of SHOAH itself. So that's it. I'd like to end there. Again, if you have stayed with me up to now, I'd like to thank you very much, because I know the videos were long and it was a little bit of a slight departure from my usual videos, and the subject matter, I think, was very serious and at times quite intense. At least the film, as it were, and my discussions of those films. I don't know if I was able to make comments that were worthy of the discussion, and if I failed, I apologize, but I really wanted to convey, or at least part of the reason why I wanted to make this video was to try to convey to you how much I feel that this film is so important, and that we are so fortunate to be able to have it in the Criterion Collection and also the Masters of Cinema. But it's something that should be seen by everyone, because it really is. We are so fortunate to be able to watch it, and it is a tough watch, it is a difficult watch, and it is a very intense one. And yes, and I think discussions about the film are quite difficult, but I encourage discussions to be had, because I think if there are no discussions to be made, then it's so easy to forget the film. But I think if discussions can be had, I think that is very healthy and very helpful. And also, if those discussions can be as specific as possible, I think that is even more helpful. I always find I'm reading essays, and I find the ones or the reviews, and the ones that I find more compelling for me are the ones that go as specific as possible with respect to maybe an example of an episode, maybe of Abraham Bomba or Simon Srebnik, or what Philip Muller talks about, or Rudolf Bra, or the exchange between Lanzmann and Franz Hummel, or the Polish population including Mr. Borowy, etc., that are interviewed by Lanzmann. So these sorts of details, when discussing the film, I think are very important, because they the whole point of SHOAH is to provide detail and to give context to this overall horrible event in history, that is the Holocaust, which is the systematic termination, extermination, killing, murder, annihilation of the European Jewish population. So I'd like to end there. Thank you very much. This has been Daisuke Beppu talking about SHOAH, and thank you.